What if the prophets who declared the Philistines would be erased were not speaking in hyperbole, but pointing to a historical process we can still trace today? Philistines exposed. What happened to them since biblical times? The short answer, given the evidence we have, is that the Philistines ceased to exist as a distinct people through a series of violent displacements, imperial policies, and gradual cultural and genetic assimilation. Yet the story is far richer than a single verdict. It is a story of migration, innovation, fierce conflict, imperial pressures, and finally transformation, preserved in pottery shards, inscriptions on stone, DNA locked in ancient bones, and in the careful witnesses of Scripture. We begin where the evidence converges. Around the end of the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1200 BC, the Eastern Mediterranean convulsed. Great palace societies collapsed, trade networks fractured, and groups on the move reshaped the map. In Egyptian records, carved into the walls of Medinet Habu, Pharaoh Ramses III depicts battles with a confederation of marauders he calls sea peoples. The biblical landscape of Canaan did not escape this upheaval. Archaeology, textual sources, and the Bible itself point to a new maritime presence on the southern Levantine coast, people who would be known to later writers as the Philistines. We call them sea peoples because that is how Egypt's scribes saw them. Maritime groups arriving by ship, striking coastal settlements, and in some cases settling on the shore rather than merely raiding it. The material, cultural fingerprints they left behind are striking. In strata dated to the early Iron Age, archaeologists uncovered pottery styles that do not match traditional Canaanite forms. These ceramics, bichrome ware with painted designs, motifs of birds and geometric patterns, stirring echoes of the Aegean world, announce a foreign origin. Specialists trace stylistic links between these wares and pottery traditions from Mycenaean Greece and the Aegean Islands. Archetypes, architectural features, and even burial practices at coastal sites display unfamiliar elements, together forming a consistent signal: new people arriving by sea, creating a new cultural horizon along the fertile coastal plain. This new horizon became Philistia, a compact coastal realm organized around a 5-city confederacy: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. Each city was a node of maritime trade and local administration. Their locations were strategic. The coastal strip is a razor's edge between the Mediterranean and the inland hill country. Control of those cities meant control of the trade arteries linking Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia. Early Philistine towns show signs of rapid urbanization: planned streets, workshops for metal and textile production, and harbors or beach installations suited to a seafaring people. Where Canaanite city life had a certain rhythm, Philistine towns carried new energies, an outward-looking maritime economy layered onto local agricultural resources. Language and names recorded in inscriptions and texts add another layer. Egyptian and Assyrian sources refer to related groups along the coast. The Hebrew Bible uses the ethnonym Pelishtim, Philistines, to describe these coastal people, and their toponyms and deities enter the biblical narrative as prominent adversaries of Israel. The Bible's portrayal is vivid and often brutal. The Philistines are not an exotic curiosity, but Israel's primary military rival during the period of the Judges and the early monarchy. This is the world of Samson, where the Philistines oppress and rule large tracts of Israelite territory, and the world of the ark's capture described in 1 Samuel 4. These biblical episodes are not archaeology, but they are part of the historical record the archaeologist seeks to illuminate. Why did the Philistines matter so much? Part of the answer lies in technology and organization. In a region transitioning from bronze to iron, the Philistines played a crucial role. Archaeological layers associated with Philistine sites show early adoption and skilled use of iron tools and weapons. ironworking centers, furnaces, and production debris. Iron materials could confer decisive advantages in the field. Moreover, the Philistines displayed military specialization, professional warriors, swift chariot detachments in earlier phases, and a social structure that supported mounted and foot soldiers. These capacities allowed the Philistines to dominate the coastal plain and to pose a sustained threat to the hill country Israelites, whose own social and military structures were in flux. Religion and identity were part of the package. Philistine religious practice took public form at sanctuaries and temples. The Bible mentions temples dedicated to Dagon, and inscriptions and iconography from the region divulge cultic symbols distinct from inland Canaanite practice. Food customs and material culture, what people ate, how they built their homes, which gods they invoked, shaped Philistine identity in ways archaeologists can partially reconstruct. These differences made their cultural footprint tangible on the archaeological record for centuries. Yet the Philistines did not remain static. The centuries that followed their arrival were marked by repeated clashes with emerging Israelite polities. During the era of the Judges, which the biblical book frames as cycles of oppression and deliverance, Philistine dominance over parts of the coast and adjacent territories is clear. Consider Samson, a figure whose saga is concentrated in Judges 13 to 16, a charismatic, violent, and ultimately sacrificial leader whose confrontations with Philistine lords reveal both the intensity of the conflict and the deep cultural rifts between the groups. Samson's feats, if read as the biblical narrative intends, underscore the asymmetrical power dynamics and the dangers Philistine militarism posed to neighboring Israelite settlements. Another biblical flashpoint comes with the capture of the Ark at Ebenezer, an episode recorded in 1 Samuel 4. The Israelites suffer a crushing defeat. The Ark is seized by the Philistines, and the narrative describes both the military humiliation and the theological crisis that event prompted among Israel. The Philistine spoil of the Ark and its subsequent return, 1 Samuel 5-6, provide not only a theological drama, but also material indicators of Philistine confidence and presence in the region. These episodes, together with the long shadow of repeated skirmishes and raids, set the stage for the rise of kings in Israel, leaders shaped by the need to confront and contain Philistine power. The arrival of Israel's early monarchs does not immediately erase the Philistine advantage. Under Saul, and especially during the reign of David, the balance of power shifts. David's defeat of Goliath, narrated in 1 Samuel 17, becomes a turning point in the biblical imagery. An Israelite shepherd strikes down a Philistine champion and initiates a broader campaign that breaks Philistine dominance. Archaeology and historical reconstruction show that the process was complex. Military victories, shifting alliances, and regional politics all played roles. Yet the biblical record firmly places the Philistines at center stage in the early monarchic period, as both adversary and a people integrated at times into the political map of the Levant. From this point, a new sequence of forces begins to shape Philistine destiny. Imperial powers from the east sweep across the Levant with different aims and mechanisms than the earlier coastal raiders. Assyria, in particular, projects power into the Levant during the 8th and 7th centuries BC. Assyrian campaigns are well documented, both in the annals and in the archaeological record. Their strategy included conquest, tribute extraction, and frequent population relocations. Cities in Philistia, like those elsewhere in the Levant, fall under Assyrian pressure. Assyrian inscriptions and administrative records mention coastal polities and the adjustments rulers made under imperial hegemony. Assyrian dominion did not instantaneously erase local identities, but it did begin a process of political restructuring. Local kings continued to rule in place, but under vassalage and with altered demographics, as people were moved, resettled, or conscripted into imperial service. Two archaeological discoveries help anchor these historical turns in concrete, tangible data. First, the Ekron inscription, uncovered at Tel Mikne Ekron, provides a rare and illuminating window into Philistine polity in the Iron Age. Dated to the 7th century BC, this monumental inscription names local rulers, gives genealogies, and lists gifts to a deity, evidence that Philistine city-states possessed organized royal households and bureaucratic structures recognizable to the broader ancient Near Eastern world. Ekron's inscription places the Philistines squarely within the administrative and political frames of the time. It also demonstrates continuity in urban life that crosses imperial transitions. Second, the excavations at Ashkelon and other coastal sites reveal urban planning, monumental public works, and craft specialization, an archaeological mirror to the literary sources that describe cities of power. But the most decisive, and for many modern observers the most surprising, kinds of evidence come from ancient DNA. In the last decade, genetic analysis has become another tool in the historian's kit, allowing us to test hypotheses about population movements and admixture. At Ashkelon, a coastal cemetery excavated and reported in the mid-2010s yielded human remains that later became part of genetic studies. Those studies, cautiously interpreted, indicate that individuals buried in the earliest Philistine-associated layers show genetic signals that are closer to populations from the Aegean and southern Europe than to the local Levantine gene pool. In other words, the people who arrived and established Philistine towns carried a genetic signature consistent with maritime migrants from across the sea. Importantly, subsequent burials at the same sites show an increasing degree of genetic admixture with the local Levantine population. The pattern suggests initial migration, followed by rapid assimilation. Within a few generations, the foreign genetic component becomes diluted as intermarriage and local incorporation proceed. This is not evidence of sudden disappearance. It is evidence of integration, of a distinct incoming population blending into the local demographic fabric over time. We must be careful with how we state genetic findings. Ancient DNA samples are limited in number and context. They represent snapshots, not exhaustive census data. The Ashkelon results, powerful as they are, come from particular burial contexts and chronological layers. Still, when paired with ceramics, architecture, and inscriptions, the genetic picture strengthens a narrative that had been suspected by archaeologists for decades. The Philistines had Aegean links at their founding, but they did not remain an isolated, unchanging ethnic island. Yet the Philistines' story is not merely a tale of cultural absorption. It is also the story of imperial wear and tear. Assyrian policies of deportation and resettlement chipped away at the region's demographic cohesion. Later, the rise of Babylon in the early 6th century BC brought decisive blows. Babylonian campaigns in the Levant involved sieges, city destructions, and mass deportations, the same instruments the Babylonians used elsewhere to consolidate control. Biblical prophetic literature anticipates and frames such judgments. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Zephaniah, and Amos speak prophetically about the fate of many neighbors, including coastal peoples. These prophetic pronouncements must be read on their own theological terms. As historical sources, they also resonate with what we see in the archaeological layers. Cities that suffer destruction strata, abrupt changes in material culture, and demographic turnover. But even before Babylon's decisive acts, Philistine resilience appears in the record. At times, Philistine cities reasserted local authority, reoccupied ruins, and adapted to the new imperial realities. Under Persian rule, which followed the fall of Babylon in the mid-6th century BC, the Levant was integrated into a vast imperial system that favored local administration and often left cultural practices intact under the umbrella of imperial taxation and tribute. Hellenistic waves, after Alexander the Great, introduced new cultural currents. Greek language and institutions spread, especially in coastal hubs connected to Mediterranean trade. Over time, the old ethnic markers that had defined Philistine identity blurred further as local populations adopted administrative languages, intermarried, and absorbed Hellenistic practices. Throughout these long centuries, the name associated with the coastal region persisted, even as the people it originally described transformed. The term that later became Palestina in Roman usage derives in part from the ancient ethnonym linked to the Philistines. The label survives, while the distinct Philistine ethnic identity fades from the record. This semantic persistence, name surviving as an administrative or geographic marker, even when the people who originally bore the name have been absorbed, is a common phenomenon in history. Cities, place names, and even exonyms can outlast the social groups that created them. All of this raises a central theological question that informed our opening hook. Did the prophetic verdicts that spoke of Philistine decline and judgment find historical fulfillment? The evidence resists a simplistic yes or no. Prophetic texts pronounce judgment in moral theological terms. History records the unfolding of forces, migration, warfare, imperial policies, and cultural mixing that can be read as the mechanisms by which those judgments were realized. A sober reading insists on both dimensions, the prophetic voice that declared consequences and the historical processes that brought about profound transformation. We can say responsibly that prophecy and history intersect without collapsing one into the other. If this skeletal outline is making you want to see the artifacts and the data laid out in front of you, subscribe and come with us as we walk the trenches and the labs, where pottery, inscriptions, and DNA meet the pages of Scripture. In the next sections, we will examine the Philistine cityscape and society in detail, what daily life looked like in their towns, how their economy worked, and how iron technology and maritime trade shaped their dominance. We will step into Judges and Samuel with an eye for archaeological corroboration. We will lay out the Ekron inscription line by line, place the Ashkelon genetic results in context, and explore the pottery typologies that first led scholars to propose Aegean links. Along the way, we will keep asking the question that guides this entire inquiry. What exactly happened to the Philistines since biblical times? To answer that, we must dig deeper into the material culture and into key episodes that defined their rivalry with Israel. Picture a Philistine harbor around the 11th century BC. Long-turned ships creak against a towing beam. Crates of amber and tin rattle as traders unload goods. In nearby workshops, smiths pound red-hot blooms of iron, producing spearheads that will be sharpened and tempered for war. The archaeological layers reveal the urban footprint of such activities: workshop debris, slag, imported pottery, and, crucially, household assemblages that show how domestic spaces were organized differently from their inland neighbors. Excavators at Ashdod and Ashkelon have uncovered houses with hearth types and floor plans that echo Aegean prototypes, alongside locally made items. Small finds, ornamental pins, belt buckles, and combs display decorative motifs familiar to southern Aegean art, reinforcing the picture of a people bringing parts of their material repertoire with them. Those material signs complement textual traces. In the Bible, the Philistines are often named through the lens of battle and rivalry, but occasional glimpses show cultural particularities, different dietary laws, foreign deities, and social structures centered in the coastal city-states. Scholars note that the Israelite-Philistine frontier was not only military but cultural, a meeting place of practices where intermarriage and bilingual exchange would, over time, weaken the boundaries that once seemed decisive. A military snapshot helps explain why. Iron weapons and specialized warriors give a people an edge, especially against lightly armed rural levies. The Philistines' early command of iron technology and their maritime mobility allowed them to control coastal logistics and to project force inland when necessary. This advantage made them formidable opponents for Israelite clans and proto-state formations. But technology can be adopted, and warfare can lead to cultural exchange. As the Israelite polity consolidated and learned to harness different forms of military organization, the Philistines faced a growing adversary, one that would eventually, under David and his successors, curtail Philistine autonomy. Even as warfare shaped political outcomes, economic integration and cultural contact did the quiet work of assimilation. Shoreline trade brought goods and ideas. Marriages and patronage networks knitted families across prior ethnic lines. Pottery styles that once marked difference gradually hybridized. At Ekron, the inscriptional record speaks of kings who bear names legible to both local and imperial scribes, indicating a multi-layered identity that bridged different worlds. When we read that inscription, we see rulers listing offerings and the yields of fields, an administration deeply engaged in the everyday governance of a city embedded in regional systems of taxation and economy. Such bureaucratic detail is a marker of normalcy, of people who have put down roots, farmed lands, and paid tribute, signs that foreign arrival had transitioned into settled statehood. Yet the shadow of empire moves across this settled life. Assyrian campaigns in the 8th and 7th centuries BC target coastal rulers. Reliefs and royal annals mention campaigns that displace populations or force vassalage. Where deportation occurs, whether under Assyria or later under Babylon, local identities are strained. Deportation scatters communities, sometimes to be replaced by new populations brought in by imperial policy. The demographic turbulence is visible in sudden changes in archaeological assemblages, an earlier pottery horizon replaced by new wares, settlement layers showing burning and abandonment, or the abrupt cessation of specific cultic practices in the material record. The prophets, responding to such upheavals, interpret many of these events as fulfillment of divine judgment, but the archaeological nuance matters. While some sites show destruction and abandonment, others show continuity. Philistine cities could be rebuilt, repopulated, or adapt old structures to new uses. The process of disappearance as a distinct people is therefore not a single cataclysmic moment across the entire coastal plain. It is a patchwork. Some places were devastated and emptied, others persisted, only to be gradually reshaped by imperial administration, Hellenistic fusion, and local assimilation. The genetic picture matches this narrative. Initial migrant signatures, then increasing local admixture. Inscriptions and architecture mirror both continuity and change. As we move from cultural description to a closer look at particular episodes of conflict, we must hold two things in balance. First, the biblical texts are contemporaneous witnesses to an environment of intense rivalry. They tell the story from an Israelite perspective, where Philistines are both enemy and neighbor. Second, the archaeological and genetic data provide material constraints and clarifications. What the biblical authors could not or did not record, we can sometimes detect in layers of ash, in shards of pottery, and in the sequences of burial. Reading these sources together, scripture, inscription, and stratigraphy, gives us the best chance of reconstructing what happened. One of the most important case studies for this method is the Ark narrative. In 1 Samuel 4, the Philistines defeat the Israelites and take the Ark of the Covenant into their shrines. The biblical account records that Dagon's statue fell before the Ark, creating a theological spectacle in Philistine territory, 1 Samuel 5. The story serves the biblical author's purposes, an instrument for theological reflection, but it also reflects the reality of Philistine temple culture and the ways sacred objects and political power intersected. When the ark is returned in 1 Samuel 6, the text provides a narrative of humiliation and of the Philistines' encounter with a foreign cult object. Archaeology cannot corroborate the ark itself, but it can provide context. Shrines, cultic deposits, and votive offerings in Philistine sanctuaries confirm that religious institutions were central to civic life. Another episode, the rise of a united monarchy and David's campaigns, marks a shift in regional hegemony. When David defeats Goliath and later campaigns against Philistine strongholds, the political map changes. Philistine cities, once dominant, become contested spaces, sometimes subordinated to Israelite rule. But subjugation does not necessarily mean annihilation. Philistine towns retained enough material continuity to be recognizable archaeologically for centuries after David. Rulers continued to administer city life. Temple cults continued. Indeed, the Ekron inscription centuries later still speaks in the language of kingship and civic ritual. What changes is the balance of power, and over longer stretches of time, the demographic and cultural tapestry. As we prepare to unpack these developments more carefully, tracing how military events, imperial decrees, and social practices combined to erode Philistine distinctiveness, we must keep the evidence in view. In the coming sections, we will return to three pillars of proof: the pottery traditions that first made scholars posit an Aegean origin, the Ekron inscription that situates a Philistine polity within the administrative world of the Near East, and the genetic results from Ashkelon that reveal the demographic mechanics of migration and assimilation. Each pillar by itself is suggestive. Together they build a robust, multidisciplinary case. For now, stand with us on the shoreline once more. Imagine the first generation of Philistines stepping from their ships, bringing with them distinctive painted pots and new building practices. See them settle in sites that would become Ashkelon and Ashdod, build temples to Dagon, plant groves, and lay out streets. Hear the clink of iron on stone as smiths forge implements that give them tactical advantage. Watch as traders link those towns to Cyprus and the Aegean. Then fast forward as imperial boots and foreign tongues cross the plain, as Seleucid and Roman coins jingle in markets, and as the name of the land, Philistia, then Palestine, becomes a geographic label for conquerors and subjects alike. This is where we will pause before stepping fully into the long arc of decline and transformation. We have sketched the arrival, the rise, and the early conflicts, the origin story. What remains is to trace the slow unraveling, the mechanics of Assyrian pressure, the final blows of Babylon, the administrative overlay of Persia, and the Hellenistic and Roman cultural currents that finalize the Philistines' absorption into larger imperial identities. We will also take a close look at the physical traces, the pottery shards, the royal inscription from Ekron, and the ancient DNA from Ashkelon, so that when we answer the title question in full, the answer rests not on rhetoric, but on layered, converging evidence. Assume for a moment the plain statement that opened our investigation. Prophets declared the Philistines would be judged and reduced. How did that verdict translate into historical reality? To answer that fully, we must trace, step by step, the overlapping pressures that transformed a distinct coastal people into a memory carried by place names and archaeological remnants. The remainder of our story follows three intertwined threads: imperial pressure and population movements that altered political and demographic realities, archaeological and genetic evidence that lets us see migration and assimilation at work, and the theological and literary record that interprets those events from an Israelite perspective. Together, they allow us to answer the title question: what happened to the Philistines since biblical times? The first thread is empire, Beginning in the 9th and intensifying in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, the great powers of Mesopotamia and the Levant reached deeper into the coastal plain. Assyria's expansion under rulers such as Tiglath-Pileser III, Shalmaneser IV, Sargon II, and later Sennacherib and Esarhaddon changed the political map. Assyrian strategy combined direct military conquest with a fiscal and administrative logic. Local rulers could remain in place provided they paid tribute and accepted imperial control. Rebellious cities were subjected to punitive campaigns, and populations were at times deported and redistributed to prevent further insurrection. In the Levant, this meant that the 5 Philistine city-states, Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, found themselves enmeshed in a web of vassal treaties, tribute obligations, and occasional violent subjugation. Assyrian annals and reliefs document campaigns across the coastal plain and describe rulers who were compelled to send tribute or to accept Assyrian governors. The result for the Philistine cities was a reworking of political sovereignty. Kings continued to appear, but they increasingly operated under imperial constraints. These adjustments altered the balance of elite power, disrupted local loyalties, and set in motion demographic changes through deportations and resettlements. Assyrian pressure did more than reshape elite politics. It also accelerated processes of cultural blending. Under the shadow of empire, trade routes shifted, administrative languages and practices spread, and populations moved, sometimes forcibly, sometimes as part of voluntary migration tied to economic opportunities. Philistine cities, always exposed to Mediterranean commerce, now absorbed new administrative habits and a more multi-ethnic population mix. In some places, this resulted in remarkable continuity. Archaeological layers show urban activity persisting despite political subordination. In other places, Assyrian campaigns left clear destruction strata, followed by reoccupation with altered material culture. It is in this mosaic, continuity in some neighborhoods, rupture in others, that the slow erosion of a clearly bounded Philistine identity took place. Then came Babylon. The early 6th century BC marks a decisive chapter in Levantine history. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under Nebuchadnezzar II and his predecessors, carried out campaigns that reshaped population distributions across the Near East. Jerusalem's destruction in 586 BC and the deportation of portions of Judah's population are the most famous instances. But the Babylonian approach to conquered territories more generally included sieges, city destructions, and deportations designed to break local power structures. Philistine cities did not escape these pressures. Biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel among them, speak directly to the fate of the coastal towns. See Jeremiah 47 and Ezekiel 25:15-17. And the archaeological record shows corresponding destruction layers in several sites dated to this era. Where Babylonian campaigns produced depopulation, these cities sometimes became receptacles for new groups transplanted by imperial policy, or they lay dormant until new populations resettled them under subsequent regimes. In short, Babylonian military strategy increased demographic churn and made the coastal plain yet more heterogeneous. After Babylon fell, another imperial model emerged under Cyrus and the Achaemenid Persians. Persian imperialism operated on a different logic: widespread tolerance for local customs and the reinstallation of local administrators in exchange for reliable tribute. In many provinces, this meant that cities were allowed to recover their civic rhythms so long as they served the fiscal needs of the empire. Philistine cities under Persian hegemony again illustrate a mixed picture. Some urban centers resumed agricultural production and trade. Others remained marginal. The Persian period also facilitated longer-term processes of cultural normalization, administrative standardization, wider circulation of goods and people, and the imposition of economic incentives that encouraged integration across ethnic lines. Hellenistic transformations under Alexander the Great and his successors introduced a new cultural current. Greek language, coins, and institutions spread rapidly across the eastern Mediterranean, and coastal cities, open by their nature to seafaring links, were especially quick to adopt Hellenistic patterns. Hellenization meant architectural renovations, the introduction of Greek religious forms and civic institutions, new commercial elites who transacted in Greek currency, and multilingual urban life. Over generations, local identities absorbed Hellenistic elements, creating hybrid civic cultures. When Rome later reorganized the eastern provinces, and after the Bar Kokhba revolt, issued administrative renamings in the 2nd century AD, the geographic label connected to the ancient Philistines, Palestina, had long since become a regional descriptor rather than a direct sign of an intact ethnic group. The Roman use of the term stabilized a toponym that had persisted in various forms, but by that late date, the social reality it labeled was already a palimpsest of peoples, languages, cults, and administrative traditions accumulated over many centuries. Through all these imperial shifts, local processes continued to do much of the transforming work. Intermarriage, bilingualism, changing religious practices, and economic exchange steadily weakened the boundaries that once marked Philistine separateness. A young Philistine family that married into a neighboring Levantine household began to blur lines of descent. Children grew up with mixed cultural repertoires, pottery shapes and decorative styles transformed gradually through such domestic-level exchanges. These everyday processes, multiplied across towns and generations, can be as historically decisive as armies. That slow, quiet blurring is precisely what genetic and material evidence reveal when read alongside textual sources. This brings us to the second thread, archaeology and genetics, where we can see migration, adaptation, and admixture reflected in tangible remains. We have already touched on the pottery evidence that first alerted scholars to an Aegean connection. To expand that picture, stratigraphic sequences in coastal sites from the early Iron Age show the arrival of new ceramic types marked by bichrome painting and by shapes and decorative vocabulary that scholars link to southern Aegean and Mycenaean traditions. These are not isolated curiosities. Hearth types, certain architectural configurations, and burial practices in early Philistine strata cluster together and differ from inland Canaanite norms. Over time, those foreign styles hybridize with local Levantine forms, producing pottery assemblages that speak to active cultural exchange. The Ekron inscription provides another axis of evidence that moves us beyond potsherds to polity and administration. Discovered at Tel Mikne and dating to the 7th century BC, the Ekron inscription is a monumental text that names rulers, references civic offerings, and ties the city to regional political structures. Its existence confirms that Philistine city-states could maintain royal households, bureaucratic practices, and cultic institutions well into the 1st millennium BC, centuries after their initial maritime foundations. The inscription thus complicates a simplistic picture of immediate, total annihilation. It shows civic resilience and administrative integration, even as political autonomy ebbed and flowed under imperial pressures. Ekron's textual voice speaks to urban continuity, kings who list gifts, the dedication of cultic objects, and reference to agricultural yields, all the everyday markers of municipal life. That bureaucratic vocabulary testifies to a people who had long since settled into the Near Eastern political landscape. In recent years, ancient DNA has added a striking new dimension to the debate. Samples from burial contexts at Ashkelon, published and analyzed with careful attention to context and chronology, reveal a pattern we can read with precision and prudence. Individuals from early Iron Age layers associated with Philistine material culture show genetic signals that lean toward populations in the Aegean and southern Europe. In contrast, later individuals from the same cemetery display increasing admixture with the local Levantine gene pool. The interpretation scholars favor is straightforward and plausible. An initial influx of people with Aegean affinities settled along the coast. They intermarried with locals and, within a few generations, their distinct genetic signature became diluted as new familial ties and local births shifted the demographic equilibrium. We must emphasize the caveats. Ancient DNA samples are limited in number and selective by preservation and excavation context. They provide snapshots rather than encyclopedic coverage. Nonetheless, when these genetic snapshots are combined with pottery, architecture, and inscriptional evidence, they produce a convergent picture of migration followed by rapid assimilation. Three archaeological pillars thus anchor our reconstruction: the pottery that marked an Aegean arrival, the Ekron inscription that attests to established Philistine polity in the Iron Age, and the Ashkelon genetic results that show demographic mechanics of migration and admixture. Each pillar alone is suggestive. Together, they form a robust multidisciplinary argument. The ceramics tell us about cultural origins and transmission. Ekron tells us political and administrative continuity. Ashkelon's DNA tells us how distinct genetic markers were integrated into the larger Levantine population. Put differently, material culture, textual evidence, and genetic data describe different dimensions of the same historical processes: movement, settlement, interaction, and eventual absorption. We now must reconcile this evidence with the biblical, prophetic, and narrative tradition, our third thread. Prophetic texts such as Amos, Zephaniah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel contain oracles against the coastal cities. Amos 1:6-8 pronounces judgment on Gaza. Zephaniah 2:4-7 names the Philistine cities as objects of condemnation, and Jeremiah 47 speaks to Philistine distress. Ezekiel also addresses Philistine territories, Ezekiel 25:15-17, and these prophetic pronouncements reflect the prophetic imagination's ethical assessment of Israel's neighbors. Read as theological claims, they declare that the Philistines will face consequences for violence and hostility. Read as historical witnesses, they are part of a literary landscape that responds to real-world events, raids, sieges, and imperial upheavals. The prophetic verdicts do not always map in neat chronological one-to-one onto specific archaeological destructions. Rather, they articulate a theological interpretation of a cluster of historical phenomena: military defeat, exile, depopulation, and cultural decline. When archaeology shows destruction layers, abandonment, or demographic turnover in relevant periods, historians note a correspondence, one that allows a careful reading of prophecy and history together without collapsing the theological claims into straightforward historical forecasting. An important nuance emerges here. Prophetic texts often address proximate political contexts and interpret imperial events as instruments of divine judgment. Thus, the prophet's words about Philistia correspond to a longer historical arc of pressure and decline rather than to a single catastrophic extinction. The historical pattern is complex. At times, Philistine cities were battered and emptied. At times, they persisted with new populations or local elites, reshaping civic life. The prophet's rhetoric of judgment finds fulfillment not in a single instant, but in the cumulative effects of military defeat, deportation policies, and cultural assimilation. To illustrate how these dynamics operated in practice, consider the patchwork fate of different Philistine cities. Some sites show destruction and abandonment in the early 6th century BC, consistent with Babylonian offensives. Other sites show continuity into the Achaemenid and even Hellenistic periods, albeit with material cultures increasingly mixed with broader Mediterranean forms. Ashkelon, for example, re-emerges as a significant Hellenistic and Roman port city. Gaza likewise continued as a regional center in successive empires. These survivals demonstrate that local civic life adapted to new realities rather than disappearing wholesale. At the same time, the people who integrated into these cities over centuries were not purely Philistine in the old sense. They were a composite population shaped by intermarriage, economic migration, imperial relocation, and cultural adoption. This is the crucial historical point. Disappearance as a distinct ethnic category is not the same as complete demographic extinction. Philistine identity dissolved into a broader Levantine and Mediterranean mix, leaving its mark on place names, ruins, and memory, rather than as a cohesive, separate people into the Roman era. It is also important to highlight how material culture records cultural negotiation rather than unilateral erasure. Pottery styles hybridized, cultic artifacts show syncretism, and inscriptions reveal leaders operating in a shared Near Eastern administrative idiom. Such evidence supports an image of porous boundaries and active exchange. Over generations, younger city dwellers likely knew multiple languages, worshipped in ways that blended traditions, and used objects that reflected composite identities. This everyday syncretism is the human engine of assimilation. At this point, a sober answer to the title question begins to take shape. The Philistines, first visible on the shores of Canaan in the early Iron Age with clear Aegean markers, became a dominant coastal force through maritime trade, iron technology, and urban organization. They fought and competed with Israel for centuries, a rivalry captured vividly in the books of Judges and Samuel, and in stories like Samson and David's confrontation with Goliath, Judges 13:16, 1 Samuel 17. Over the long term, however, imperial interventions, Assyrian vassalage and deportation policies, Babylonian sieges and removals, Persian administrative integration, combined with local processes of intermarriage, economic exchange, and cultural blending to dissolve Philistine ethnic distinctiveness. The archaeological record confirms this trajectory. Pottery and architecture mark an Aegean arrival and an initial cultural island. Inscriptions like that at Ekron reveal urban resiliency, and ancient DNA from sites such as Ashkelon shows an early foreign genetic signature that becomes increasingly Levantine within a few generations. We must resist two kinds of mistakes in drawing our conclusion. The first is to equate disappearance with absolute annihilation. The evidence does not support a claim that the Philistines were physically wiped out without descendants. Rather, it supports the claim that Philistines ceased to exist as a distinct ethnic group identifiable in the archaeological and textual record after successive centuries of mixing, resettlement, and cultural adoption. The second mistake is to conflate the ancient Philistines with any modern population. While the ancient ethnonym survives in later place names and in the historical memory of the region, the social and genetic landscape of the Levant, after centuries of imperial rule, migrations, and cultural change, is enormously complex. Making direct, unqualified links between ancient groups and modern peoples is both historically and ethically fraught. We can now draw our threads into a final synthesis that answers the question posed by our title. What happened to the Philistines since biblical times? They arrived as maritime migrants in the early Iron Age, built a distinctive coastal civilization that played a major role in regional politics, and engaged in prolonged conflict with Israel. Over the course of the first millennium BC, the Philistine cities were repeatedly impacted by the centrifugal forces of empire. Assyria first, then Babylon, followed by integration under Persia and cultural transformation during the Hellenistic and Roman periods. These imperial episodes, together with the quieter but pervasive effects of intermarriage, local adoption of religion and customs, and economic integration, produced the gradual assimilation of Philistine identity into the diverse mosaic of the Levant. Archaeological data, pottery typologies, the Ekron inscription, urban stratigraphy, and genetic studies, particularly from Ashkelon, converged to show a pattern of initial foreign arrival followed by swift admixture with local populations. Thus, the Philistines did not so much vanish overnight as become indistinguishable over generations from the surrounding peoples. Their memory lived on in place, names, and in the literature of neighbors and conquerors. That conclusion also shapes how we read the prophetic literature. Prophetic pronouncements that foretold Philistine judgment can be understood as theological interpretations of real historical processes: military defeats, deportations, demographic dilution, and civic reconfiguration. The fulfillment of prophecy, in this case, is less a matter of a single, miraculous erasure, and more a long-term historical reality in which the social and political conditions prophesied against played out through known historical mechanisms. That reading preserves the theological force of the prophets while maintaining historical nuance. Prophecy and history intersect without one simply being reducible to the other. Before we close, it is worth pausing for a careful reminder of method and limitation. Archaeology and ancient DNA are powerful tools, but they are inherently partial. Pottery and inscriptions tell us about cultural repertoires and political institutions. Bones yield biological data that must be interpreted within tight chronological and contextual frames. No single dataset is conclusive on its own. Our strongest conclusions come when multiple lines of evidence converge. In the case of the Philistines, that convergence is remarkable. Textual witnesses, material culture, inscriptional records, and genomic snapshots all point toward a story of migration, settlement, resilience, imperial disruption, and eventual assimilation. Finally, we return to the human dimension of that story. The Philistines were not faceless agents of history, but communities of families, artisans, priests, merchants, and rulers who lived, loved, worked, worshipped, and died on the Levantine shore. Their churches and shrines, Dagon, Ashtoreth, and others recorded in the literature, tell us about their spiritual lives. Their workshops and smithies tell us about their skills. Their burial grounds and domestic spaces tell us about the rhythms of everyday life. Over centuries, those human lives braided together with neighboring populations to form a new social fabric that no longer bore the old ethnic label in a distinct way. That is the heart of the answer. Not an annihilation, but a transformation, recorded in shards of pottery, inscribed stone, and genes that whisper of far-off seas. If you want to follow the evidence further, see the Bitrome pottery that first signaled Aegean connections, read the Ekron inscription line by line, and examine the Ashkelon genetic data in its archaeological context. Subscribe for our detailed follow-up episodes, where we will lay out maps, excavation reports, and primary sources so you can trace the evidence yourself. For now, let this narrative stand as a careful synthesis. The Philistines rose as maritime newcomers, became a dominant coastal presence, and over centuries, under the combined pressures of empire and everyday social integration, ceased to exist as a distinct people, yet left a legacy preserved in ruins, texts, and the enduring name that labeled the land they once inhabited. For more deep dives into archaeology and Bible history, subscribe and watch our two-part series exploring the pottery, inscriptions, and DNA that bring the ancient world back into focus.